Right now, let's take you to this story. Climate envoys from the European Union, France, Germany, the United Kingdom and the United States have come together to find solutions to the climate crisis facing the world. They briefed the media on the Just Energy Transition Partnership and the finalization of an investment plan to guide South Africa's just transition. What were the outcomes? Well, we are joined by Mminele. He's the head of the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team. Mr. Mminele, thank you very much for speaking to us here on eNCA. Firstly, can you share with us exactly what is entailed in the first phase, at least, of the Just Energy Transition project?
Thank you very much, Masego, and good morning to the viewers of eNCA. As you say, we have just been hosting in the last few days the climate envoys from the partner countries that with us form the Just Energy Transition Partnership. And really, the purpose of this visit was for us, together with international partners, to take stock on the various pieces of work that are currently underway as we give effect to this partnership and the development of an investment plan and further engagements on the financing offer that we received from these partners, in particular, were the focus areas of our detailed engagement. As you would recall, at COP26 last year in Glasgow, these partners came together and committed to support South Africa's transition to a low-carbon economy and a more climate-resilient society by way of pledging to mobilize an initial amount of $8.5 billion over a period of 3 to 5 years to help support this transition, with 3 priority sectors being identified for where these funds should be deployed. First and foremost being our electricity sector, and then the green hydrogen sector, and the development of a manufacturing base here in South Africa for electric vehicles.
All right, so what would it take, though, Mr. Mminele, to achieve just transition, especially in poor regions in our country?
Well, the just component is a very central feature of this partnership, and it is aimed at making sure that those communities, those employees that are currently highly dependent on the coal value chain and fossil fuels in general, that the most affected employees are sufficiently protected, firstly from the effects of the transition, as well as securing their future in terms of new employment opportunities arising from the green economy, which in some instances require retraining, reskilling, skills developments generally, and other forms of equipping people for the future, including health support. And in this regard, a very challenging socioeconomic context is what this just component really seeks to address, to make sure that as we transition to a greener future, the risks, the opportunities, the challenges and responsibilities that come with this transition are allocated fairly.
Now, South Africa's just transition won't happen overnight, of course. We've heard that it will take probably 3 to 5 years. How important is it that consultations and extensive levels of planning are not overlooked?
Well, in fact, if you look at the overall transition, this Just Energy Transition Partnership covers just an initial period of 3 to 5 years and an initial amount of $8.5 billion. But the process overall is probably a 2 or 3 decade process in terms of how long this will take. And the amounts that are needed are also vastly more than this initial $8.5 billion. But there will be a consultation with key stakeholders on the investment plan during the next a couple of months, and including through working groups in each of these priority areas I was talking about that have been established, and that will include both representatives from the private sectors and the public sector, so that at the end of the day, we ensure that the investment plan represents a shared vision for South Africa's transition and a program of action to achieve both our climate commitments, but also making sure that in the process, national objectives based on an inclusive framework are also achieved.
One of the concerns, Mr. Mminele, of course, is how the move to green energy will affect coal-dependent communities and sectors in our country, at least in our country, that is. Have you considered this, and what would be the solution?
Well, I think, as you intimated earlier, Masego, is obviously not an overnight process. This transition is going to take years, and we will continue to rely on coal for electricity generation for a while, as and when, over time, the aging fleet of our power station gets replaced by more modern and more cleaner energy sources, in particular renewables, as we invest in strengthening our transmission infrastructure so that the new forms of energy and renewables that come on stream can be appropriately accommodated. So it's a longer-term process which will require, as we go along, in particular what we've just been said, consulting with the communities, hearing what their needs are, and making sure that we make them and the country as best as we can future-proof for a green economy, which is all in our best interest.
Let's take it to an international level and talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, late last month, the International Energy Agency warned that Europe should be ready to, or rather ready for Russia to turn off all gas exports to the region this winter as the country seeks to gain political leverage, etc. That would mean certain European countries are scrambling to ensure their energy needs are met during the coldest time. And that's only later this year in Europe of the year, and perhaps then backtrack on their climate pledges in favor of firing up coal power plants. How's this likely scenario going to affect the plans and the implementation of this partnership?
Well, it's a discussion that we also had in the last couple of days as we're engaging with the climate envoys to get a sense of their assessment. And they were indeed, at the conclusion of the visit yesterday, were asked as a part of a media briefing that we hosted how this would pan out, and what their responses were that clearly the Russia-Ukraine conflict has changed the environment somewhat, which may lead to them temporarily consuming more coal and relying more on coal-generated power, but overall that would not detract them from meeting their commitment to weaning themselves of coal over time. An example that was cited yesterday was the UK, for example, who said that by sort of 2024, they will stick to those commitments to be no longer reliant on fossil fuels. But the crisis has required people to produce short-term workarounds, but we are assured that the overall progress towards cleaner fuels is in place. And my German colleague yesterday also highlighted and made the point that in some ways, this crisis actually accelerates that process of reducing the dependency on gas, including Russian gas.
Mr. Mminele, I want to go back to the question around, the fact that there are some sectors who rely on coal, etc. I mean, we had the energy minister not so long ago, telling those who are in that industry to protect their industry. So how's that relationship going to work if you're trying to, speak to stakeholders in that sector to say that, we need to move to more green efficiency, etc. And then you have a minister saying, no, protect your industry?
Well, Marcelo, it is certainly not my impression that what the minister has been saying is that we should not move forward. And the key driver of all these processes is a commitment that South Africa has given internationally, both for our own good, but also from the perspective of our contribution to the global response to climate change risks, which is the so-called nationally determined contribution. And that is a document that was approved by Cabinet. It's a document that was generated and coordinated by the Presidential Climate Change Commission, involved extensive consultations with various communities before that document was tabled to Cabinet, and that is the guiding sort of light, if you wish, and document in terms of our transition. I think what the Minister is cautioning against is exactly what I'm talking about, that we must just make sure that we don't leave anybody behind, as the President has also been saying, and to ensure that these communities are sufficiently protected and that their livelihood are secured as best as one can. But even talking to the affected communities, I mean, they fully realize that relying on this fossil fuel value chain, in particular coal, is simply unsustainable.
All right, let's talk about, talking about fossil fuel and coal, etc. There has been talk now of an Eskom 2.0 and concerns that this, if at all really a plan that government will actually implement, will help at all, because our leaders should be working to fix what we already have instead of spending money starting something that would run parallel. Now, there's this Presidential Climate Task Team that you head. How's your relationship, firstly, with the Environmental Affairs Department? And just explain to us what your task would be that would be different from that particular department.
Well, the issue around the role of the task team, maybe to clarify it, and maybe let me start directly with what you asked. The Environmental Department is very key in a structure through which we report. We report to Cabinet via an interministerial committee that has been established, which has that department very much at the center of it. And our role as the task team is to work with these international partners that form the Just Energy Partnership and translate their commitment that they made to mobilize this funding into actual financial flows that will support South Africa in transition. So the mandate is really to advance this partnership and ultimately to advise Cabinet and the President on the best possible investment plan and financing package that reconciles and strikes a defensible balance between various conflicting forces in terms of how we transition responsibly. So there's no conflict or contradictions in terms of the various pieces of the South African government that are working on this.
All right. So, Mr. Mminele, just as a parting question, back to the Russia-Ukraine topic. We all see how this is affecting people's pockets all over the world. But here in South Africa and in the African continent, really, I think we're feeling the pinch more. Yesterday, the Reserve Bank increased the repo rate, and we know that interest rate is now the highest it's been in 13 years. What is your outlook for our economy as a person who used to be the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank?
Well, I have every trust and faith in my former colleagues, and I think the measures that they took were explained well and are a necessary response to make sure that in the long run we protect particularly the poor from the vagaries of inflation. We are obviously entering a very difficult period both in the global economy and in the domestic economy. That needs to be managed very carefully. But the situation brought about, firstly, by obviously COVID, which we were busy recovering from when we got these other supply shocks, are such that they require us to very, very carefully manage our macroeconomic situation. And unfortunately, nobody likes steep interest rate increases, but I fully support the moves taken by the South African Reserve Bank because that is really what is required to ensure that in the long run we protect our economy and the livelihoods of people by protecting them from the dire consequences of runaway inflation.
All right. Thank you very much for speaking to us, Mr. Daniel Mminele. He's the head of the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team. All right. Let's